City University Television. In association with the Center for Advanced Study in Theater Arts. And the Harold Clurman Endowment. Presents Spotlight.
Welcome to Spotlight. I'm Ed Wilson, and my guest is one of the most original voices in the American theater, the playwright and director Maria Irene Fornes. Irene, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. I want to talk about your plays, both your writing and your directing, but first I'd like to talk a little bit about your background. You did not start out to be a playwright, I believe. Weren't you a painter at first?
No, yes, I was a painter. Before I was a painter, I was a musician.
Oh, really?
Yes, only I was a terrible musician.
What, were you a singer or did you play an instrument?
I studied a violin for about 3 months.
Yes.
And
How old were you at that point?
I was about 12.
Yes.
And I drove my family crazy and my neighbors and myself crazy.
Now, at this point, you grew up in Cuba?
Yes.
So were you still
I was in Cuba.
You were still in Cuba at
Yes.
this point.
Yes.
And so you turned from the violin and you came to the United States when you, what, about 15?
15.
And then you, as I recall, you had a lot of odd jobs?
Oh, yes, yes.
And
Yes, I started working as soon as, a couple of months after I arrived here. And so I didn't know what I wanted to do. Also, I didn't know what I could do. So I tried all kinds of things.
So, but you finally did become, you met some people who were involved in painting, or you?
No, let me see how it started. My father was always very interested in the arts, and he encouraged all the children to be involved in one art or the other. So I had, my older sister was friends with a group of young artists in Havana. She was 5 years older than I was, so she was about 19 by the time I left Cuba, she was. But one of these painters these were young men who were going to the academy to study painting, sculpture, and one of them came to New York shortly after we did, and so I can't remember how it happened, whether I asked him if he would give me some classes, or I have no recall at all. But I remember then the very first class he gave, he was a still life, and he put a vase on the table, and he said, "Well, draw that."
And
So,
and you went to Europe too, studying painting.
Yeah, that was later on. That was in '54. I went to. Before I went to Europe, I had done some studying here with Hans Hofmann.
Yes.
Very briefly, because it was just a summer at Provincetown, just one summer, and he had enormous influence in me as a person, and even as a writer. I discovered only recently, remembering some of the things he used to say about painting, about color and dynamics and energies that are very active in my approach to.
You think they've remained with you then,
Completely.
as an influence? Mm-hmm. But you only recognize this recently?
Very recently.
That's fact, because it's been a long time now.
Yes.
And
yes.
so, well, now, at what point did you realize that you were a playwright rather than a painter?
Well, as a painter, I went to Paris, and I say as a painter because it was. I had no reason to go to Paris to paint, because you could paint anywhere in the world. But in those days, this was 1954. You went to Paris. If you were a painter, if you were a writer, you went to Paris. So I did. And when I was in Paris, I spent most of my time sitting in cafes and talking about art. not really doing so much of very much of it. And I did try. I would force myself, you know, because I didn't have the kind of natural connection with painting that I have with writing, and particularly writing for theater. The very first attempt at writing a play, I was totally engrossed and fascinated with the process. I never had to force myself once to, you know, to discipline myself, to say I must go and do some work.
Which you had to do as a painter.
As a painter, it was a constant struggle.
But the first time you wrote, that was Tango, was that Tango Palace?
Yes, that was Tango
The first
Palace.
thing, and
Yes.
as I recall, you've said that you sat down and wrote for what, 18 or 19?
19 days. 19 days.
And just, I mean, were you sort of, was it more or less obsessive or?
It was totally obsessive. I don't know. I think I was possessed. I don't think it was obsessive. You're still a little bit conscious. I was totally possessed. I only left my apartment to go down and get food from the grocery store and bring it back up. That's the only time that I left the house in those 19 days. And I had a job, and I called work because I started on a weekend. It was Friday, I think, Friday evening. And then on Monday, I called and I said I was sick. And I was probably telling the truth because, and they said, well, when do you think? And I said, well, probably maybe tomorrow. Probably I think I'll be okay tomorrow. And then each day I called and I say I'm not feeling well yet, and it was exactly 19 days, and I don't remember why is it that then I went to work on the 20th day, and I don't remember if it was that I had finished a certain part of the play that I felt, you know, I felt I could take a breath, but it was like entering, like I entered a world. I often think of it as the experience of Alice in Wonderland when she goes through the hall. Once you go through, you don't.
And you've never looked back then. I mean, you've known ever since then that the theater was really your life.
Yes, completely.
And so you've been involved in one aspect of it or another ever since then.
Right.
What happened with that first play? Did you show it to someone? Did you?
Well, I didn't think I was writing a play because I was going to be a playwright. I didn't think that play would ever be put on. I just had this compulsion to write it. But it was no different than if you have a dream and then you have the desire to paint it, you know. And I remember that when I talked to people about my wanting to write it, this was before I started writing, because it was a specific idea. It wasn't just to write a play. And I would talk to my friends. I had many friends who were writers, and I would tell them I wanted to write this play, and they would say, oh, writing a play is the most difficult thing in the world. It's harder to write a play than to write a novel or a story. You never do a play that will be put on. And I thought, how ridiculous! Of course I won't. But what happened was that a friend of mine who had a young man who had started a literary magazine, and he went to San Francisco, and I think he went to San Francisco to talk to Ferlinghetti and other poets there to submit work for his magazine. And when he came back, he came to visit my friend, and he said, by the way, I met Herbert Blau in San Francisco, and he said to me, do you know any playwrights? If you know any playwrights, ask them to send me something, because I'm looking for a play to do in the small theater. He was artistic director of the Actors Workshop.
Yes, in San Francisco.
In San Francisco, which was, like, at the time, one of 4 or 5 regional theaters in the whole of the United States. And it was actually the most prestigious of.
Yes.
And I said, oh, how exciting to send it. I thought it was just to send it. How exciting to have somebody in theater read the play, because I didn't know anyone in theater. So then he wrote back and he said he wanted to do it. which was...
Did you go to see it?
Yes.
Was that...
Yeah, I went through the whole period of rehearsal.
And what was that experience like?
It was wonderful.
Yes.
He's a wonderful director and such a brilliant man that that even if the play had been terrible, listening to him direct and talk it was just fascinating.
Now that was in the early 60s.
63.
63, and the 60s proved to be a tremendously prolific and productive time for you. I mean, you wrote a number of plays in the 60s.
Right.
And Promenade, which was a musical that was a sort of marvelously carefree but a musical, and The Successful Life of Three,
Right.
and was Dr. Keel written at that time,
Right.
and a whole group of plays that you wrote at that time. And to me, one of the fascinating things about it is how different each one was from the previous one, but also how experimental they all were.
Right.
Because the form, you did different things in different ones. I mean, Promenade was part vaudeville, part sort of cinema, part sort of expressionistic. It was two actually people who'd gotten out of jail and who went through this sort of fancy society party and through a whole series of things involved with soldiers and a lot of song and dance and that. And The Successful Life of Three had a whole series of other types of transformations and other kinds of things in that. Each one had its own kind of quality, but how did that come about?
Well, you see, that came about because of the way I was writing, because I didn't know how to write a play. You see, and when you don't know how to do something, you're experimenting every minute of the way. It's like if you go to a new city where you've never been, you don't know anybody, and you don't know, you're not carrying your guidebook. Everything you do is an experiment. Whether you turn this way or that way in the street, whether you stop, whether you go in to see one movie or one play, everything is an experiment, and it was wonderful. It was wonderful. Because you know what happens when you know, like if you go to Paris and you know the places you should go, you're really not experiencing.
As you look back just on that period now, the 60s, what do you remember about the plays that you still that still remain perhaps favorites with you, and also some of the experiences of where they were done and the people they were done with?
What remains with me?
Yes.
I think one of the most glorious things was working at Judson Church with, we were doing the rehearsing Promenade, and
it was called the Judson Poets Theater, wasn't it? Or was
yes.
It? But it was at the Judson Church on Washington Square in Greenwich Village, yes.
And Al Carmines was the, is it the junior minister, the one who is not the senior?
Yes, junior minister.
Of the church, and he was, he's a composer and a minister, which was also something that, to me, it added an enormous amount of glamour to the whole theatrical experience. And we were rehearsing in the church, and the performances were in the loft, in the choir loft. The seats were placed sideways, you know, facing.
Yes, I remember that space. It was a very unusual space.
Right.
But go ahead.
And then Larry Kornfeld was the resident director there. He directed a lot of their things, and he was also constantly experimenting. Now, I wasn't really aware to what degree they were experimenting, because since I was really not very acquainted with the tradition of theater, I didn't realize how wonderful and what a gift and what a lucky experience.
It was very free and open, wasn't it? I mean, there was
completely. And also, you see, at the same time, besides the theater, the Poets Theater, there was the what were called what I think now are called Judson Dancers. I think I don't know that at the time they were called the Judson Dancers, but it was a group of dancers. Yvonne Rainer, Lucinda Childs, and David Gordon, and who were inventing dance, because they were of course, all in some way connected with Merce Cunningham, but they were younger and they were breaking away from old tradition.
Have you seen any of those plays from the 60s done recently anywhere?
No. Ellen Stewart did, I don't remember whether it was the 20th anniversary or 25th anniversary that she did.
Of La Mama.
Of La Mama. She did a number of those plays, but I wasn't in New York, so I didn't see them.
Now, in the 70s, among other things, you continued to write, but also there was a period there where you were very involved with a group called the New York Theater Strategy.
Right.
Which was a group of writers. Well,
Right.
tell me a little bit about the New York Theater Strategy.
Well, what happened was that the off-Broadway movement, which is what this group of theaters, there was only 4 theaters, Cafecino, Judson, La Mama, and Theater Genesis. And today in New York there are maybe at a given time maybe 100, because sometimes it's just a small space that's rented and it's called a theater, and then a few months later it's no longer there. There was an enormous amount of energy that went into those places from the input of people who had perhaps always wanted to do theater or who had never thought of doing theater, writers, actors, directors. Actors were, for the most part, people who wanted to do theater and would have done theater anyway. But some of the writers, I imagine that if those places had not existed, they would have not written plays. Maybe they would have written something else, but they're not plays. And the directors, I imagine, perhaps too, they would have not become directors. The emphasis in the beginning was on the playwright. The playwrights were well, usually we went for an opening because it was a playwright.
Yes.
But that lasted only about 2-3 years, really. It seemed like a much longer period of time, but it was very short. Soon the directors became more the
star,
the attention went to the
sort of center of
directors,
attention.
yes. And that was Tomo Horgan and Joe Checken, and
there were a whole series of directors who emerged in that
right.
period.
Then later on, Andre Gregory
Yes.
with the Manhattan Project, and then later on Schechner,
Yes.
and Serban. This was much later on, but it really
was part of the same trend.
Right. And it was, and the attention really never shifted back to the playwrights. It was, and it still is today, I think, probably primarily a director's experimental theater rather than the
And so was the New York Theater Strategy formed to to sort of counterbalance this?
Yes, because what happened was that Julie Bovasso and I had been asked by the person who was the new minister at the St. Clement's Church.
Yes.
When the American Place Theater moved to their own space on.
Right. And they had been at St. Clement's.
They had been at St. Clement's, and the new minister wanted to start a new theater there, and he had called us to find out from us how to go about it, and when we were telling him what he should do, that he should ask a few playwrighs that he liked to be a part of that theater, and that then when he applied for funds, he should mention the names of these playwrights, and we wished him luck, and then we went to have a cup of coffee, and at the same time, it was we looked at each other, and we said, isn't it silly that we are telling other people how to do it, when then they're going to decide whether they're going to do plays, because still, even in the places where the directors were really the stars, it was the playwrights that got the funding for the places. So it was a sort of odd kind of situation. And so we decided that we would try to form our own organization
Of writers.
of writers.
And which you did.
Yes.
And which I think you were the director of for.
Well, at first, the first few months, Julie was the president. But then, because Julie is so...
This is Julie Bavassa.
Julie Bavassa, yes. Julie would be sort of a little too erratic, and I was much more sensible. So the next election, they voted me president.
But which you remained for.
For many years,
Yes.
because being the president meant that I did all the work. And that I didn't write any plays for...
You went for a period of about 6 years or so without really writing, didn't you?
About that, yes. Well, not quite, because I did write Aurora, which was
Yes.
which was presented by the theater strategy.
But then, when did you write Fefu and Her Friends?
That was, I had started Fefu many years before, and in fact it started from an idea that I had for the Open Theater, because I was a member of the Open Theater in its second year or so. And
This was the theater directed by Joe Chaikin.
Joe Chaikin, yes. And I started this, which is actually very close to what is now the first scene in the first scene of Fefu, where she shoots someone and she says, she pretends to shoot her husband and he falls. It's a game. This is a game we play. And so I had started that long before, and I had worked a little bit on it now and then. But then I finally completed it at a point where I realized that if I continued running and doing all, because I did everything. I did the bookkeeping, all the...
This was for the theater strategy.
For theater strategy. It was like what takes 3 or 4 people. We presented 4 plays a year. The office was in my apartment. And I was the only party. There was no secretary. It was just me doing bookkeeping, reports at the end of the year, applying for funds. People would say to me, "Why do you do that? Why do you do that? You must write. You must write." And I was so indignant. People would say that. I felt that then you realize that I'm doing a very important thing.
Which you were.
Do you think I was?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Because I'm sure all those writers think that you were, and because you kept this whole idea alive, and not only, active in terms of the
Right, that's
producing
right.
4 plays a year.
That's
But let's
right.
get back to Fefu now. Yeah. So was it out of this that did you decide to go back? Because was Fefu and Her Friends the play that you wrote as you emerged from all of this administrative work?
Yes. It was a play that I think probably from the time that I wrote that very first scene to the time that the play was first presented was about 14 years.
Really?
Yes, because I think I must have started it somewhere around 65, and then it was the first
It was done in the late
was
70s.
77.
And then 78 it was done at the American Place
Right.
Theater, which is where I saw it. And we should say that one of the fascinating things about that play is that I think it's in the second act that scenes take place simultaneously in 4 different locations.
Right.
And so the audience wanders through this, and they can see what's happening in one room in the house, or go to the kitchen, or to a bedroom,
Right.
and the action is happening simultaneously, and the audience doesn't know what's happening in the other room
Right.
at that time.
Right.
How did that form come about?
Well, that happened because since I had been preparing this play for so many years, I had a number of scenes, many scenes. I didn't have it was more a theme than a plot, let's say, so the play was not developed in a linear manner, as had been most of the plays that I've written before. But there was scenes and monologues and sort of like studies. It was studies on a theme, and I had finished putting together the first act, and this play is, I decided that year I would do a play for theater strategy, and that then that somebody else would do the administration. We hired somebody to do the administration. So this person came to me and said, we should find a place now, rent a place to do your play now, because if we do it later on, it will be too late. So we went to a loft that because she said there was an ad for a loft, performing loft. Should we go look at it? And I said yes. So when we went there, I thought it wasn't right. It was, the ceiling was not high enough, and there were these columns on the side like that that made the playing area too narrow. And then we could have just turned around and left. If we had done that, I would have never written the play to be done this way. The person who was showing us the play said, would you like to see the green room? So we went to the end of the loft. They had made a separation, and there was a place there that he called the green room. It was just and then beyond that there was another division, and we went through, and it looked like a greenhouse. The whole width of the loft was windows. It was a factory.
Yes, yes.
And they had made a partition there that was just about 12 feet from the windows, and it was filled with plants. And then there was even dirt on the floor. There was so many plants that there was, from watering, how sometimes you get dirt on the floor and dead leaves. And I thought, this looks like Fefu's greenhouse.
So the space that you saw really helped determine
Completely.
the fact that you did simultaneous scenes.
Completely.
And had a great influence on that.
I didn't actually decide it at that moment. I said, this could be Fefu's house. But then he said, would you like to come to my office and we could talk about money and stuff. So we went, and there was another
space there.
He had made another partition, and it was a Victorian little study.
So that's, we're almost out of time.
Oh, okay.
I hate to say it, and we haven't even had a chance to talk about all of your work in the 80s, which we will do on another occasion. But this has been absolutely fascinating that this particular play was so influenced by the spaces that you saw in that when you went to that loft, and with the office and the greenhouse and so forth. And now, of course, it's been done other places in that same way.
Yes, oh yes, that's the only way it can be done.
That's fascinating. I'm afraid our time is up. Thank you so much. My guest has been Maria Irene Fornes, playwright and director. This has been Spotlight. Thank you for being with us.